Again, my name is Jackie. Thank you for the introduction. I'm an anthropology and LALS double major, and this is my last and final quarter here at UCSC. I'll be sharing with you a project proposal that I put together during my time with Pathways to Research program, and I'm open to any questions and suggestions you may have at the end. Like mentioned, my project is titled After the Storm Came the Spill, Unnatural Disasters and Necropolitics in Louisiana. Here's a breakdown of what I'll be discussing today, so let's get right into it. So for my research, there are three major topics that I will explore. First, I take a deeper look at the oil and gas industry that dominates the state of Louisiana and offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Second, Louisiana residents, and particularly those living in Cancer Alley, are no stranger to industrial pollution and natural disasters. And lastly, within the past 16 years, the region has experienced a devastating series of hurricanes and oil rig accidents. And because of this, I'm interested in both the slow and fast forms of environmental violence that are linked to delayed emergency response. What led me towards this topic is that I became really interested in natural disasters, but more specifically the unnaturalness of them after having my own experience with the recent CZU fires back in August 2020. I took notice in the patterns of government response to disasters. In topics in Black Studies course this past quarter, I was introduced to the foundational text, Black Geographies and the Politics of Place, which allowed me to understand how the production of space is a racialized process. This pushed me to learn more about Louisiana and its history of environmental racism, violence, and disasters. And from there, I went down the rabbit hole. So to provide some background, due to a rise in unnatural disasters in the last 2 decades, the Southern Gulf region is at the center of environmental justice debates. UCSC professor Camilla Hawthorne asserts that the work of Black geographic political economy engages the question of natural disasters and has denaturalized the concept of nature to understand the unevenly distributed causes and effects of climate change, earthquakes, and hurricanes. Wait, too soon, sorry. More specifically, the pressing need for this work, Black Geographies, is evinced in the disproportionate impacts of climate change on Black communities, the surveillance and policing of Black neighborhoods, and the new configurations of anti-Black racism, nationalism, and xenophobia represented by the global resurgence of the far right. Hawthorne also calls for a stronger connection with Latinx and Native and Indigenous geographies, which is of major interest to me. As points of departure, I'll be investigating two of the worst environmental disasters in US history, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. The worst meaning the most expensive and the most ecologically destructive. I won't get into too much detail here, but just know that both events took place in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico and equally reveal how bureaucracy at every level of government has resulted in delayed disaster response, which brings to focus the disproportionate impacts of climate change on communities of color. Luckily for me, many scholars have taken an interest in Hurricane Katrina, and the work of McKittrick and Bullard were critical to my understanding of the differential vulnerabilities that Black communities in New Orleans face in terms of environmental and economic inequality and government response to natural disasters. There was less scholarship on the Gulf spill, but what I did find in regard to the discourse of environmental responsibility and oil spill accountability is what led me towards petrochemical pollution in Louisiana's Cancer Alley. To explain some of the major terms that are important to my research, I'll begin with Louisiana's Cancer Alley, also known as the Chemical Corridor, which is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and is a site of struggle that is linked to longstanding environmental racism and neglect, and centuries of formal and informal segregation. Approximately 150 petrochemical facilities fill the area and contains one of the highest concentrations in the Western Hemisphere. Research shows that inhabitants are exposed to petrochemical contamination in the air, water, and soil, which is also of interest to me. A not so fun fact I'd like to share, ExxonMobil was one of the first founded in Baton Rouge in 1909. And if you look at the map here, Baton Rouge is just here on top, just at the beginning of the Cancer Alley region. So since the early 1900s and on, the fossil fuel reserves in Louisiana and along the Mississippi River has lured oil and gas proponents, including transnational corporations whose economic interests have increasingly involved offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Next, we have necropolitics of place. The concept of necropolitics can be understood as death worlds or as the violence of letting die. The term is broadly defined as the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die. Or according to Davies, the right to expose people to the possibility of death. In other words, not to make someone die, but to let them. Davies brings together Membe's concept of necropolitics and Nixon's slow violence to address the racialized experiences of pollution in St. James, Louisiana, a small parish in Cancer Alley. I took this idea a little further and think it's important to consider faster forms of environmental violence. Fast forms of environmental harm include delayed disaster response, and although in parallel to slow brutality such as petrochemical pollution spread out over centuries, both forms of violence coexist within an already racialized and toxic space, which leads me to my research questions. How were the disproportionate impacts of climate change and pollution on Louisiana residents exacerbated after the two disasters? In what ways do slow and faster forms of environmental violence coexist at Cancer Alley, and how do they affect Louisiana residents? And lastly, how was Louisiana's oil and gas industry impacted after Katrina and DHOS? What does the discourse tell us about the controversial debates over how these hazards have been handled? I arrived at these questions for a few reasons. The state of Louisiana is both the nation's largest energy producer and a region of devastatingly uneven geographic development and complex racial class division. This post-colonial landscape is a region that has faced the continuation of socio-environmental conflicts that wreak havoc on the livelihoods of the Black communities residing within the invisible borders of the chemical corridor. In the context of unnatural disasters, I'm really interested in the racialized experiences of climate change and pollution, as well as the slow and fast forms of environmental violence that coexist in the Southern Gulf, both on and offshore. Due to ecological destruction, displacement, delayed emergency response, and slow environmental contamination, the numerous rural, poor communities populated predominantly by African Americans, many of whom descended from slaves who once toiled on sugar plantations along the Mississippi River, are at the center of this research. This brings me to my proposed methods, which includes a content analysis of a variety of data, including news media that focus on Hurricane Katrina, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, Cancer Alley, and the oil industry before and after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm interested in the discourse of socio-environmental conflicts in the region and wanted to know more about the debates in oil spill accountability and strategies for coastal restoration in the Gulf. I found plenty of news coverage on both disasters, but I primarily focused on the news surrounding the oil spill in Cancer Alley that highlighted the environmental impacts of the industry on Louisiana residents and wildlife. In doing so, I learned more about British Petroleum, or BP, a transnational oil company who owned the Deepwater Horizon oil drilling rig, who is no stranger to oil spills in American waters, and paid out a whopping $20 billion in court fines after the spill. In terms of the scholarship, I'm interested in the literature of unnatural disasters, climate change, petropolitics, and industrial pollution. I use the frameworks of political geology, political ecology, abolition ecology, racial capitalism, and Black geographies to help me address the racialized relations of power and toxic legacies that saturate post-colonial landscapes and ultimately sustain the neoliberal economy. I coded what I founded on unnatural disasters to analyze the coexistence of slow and fast forms of environmental violence in Cancer Alley. There were also a number of available documentaries on the two disasters that were very informative. I'm interested in what happened during and after disasters and the role of the oil industry on the economy and state. After reviewing the data collected so far, the socio-environmental conflicts that ensued over the past 16 years alone have had devastating ecological effects while revealing the racialized experiences of climate change and pollution on communities of color. As I continue collecting data, I expect to find more on the environmental impacts of the oil industry, unnatural disasters, as well as the exposing of health hazards on Cancer Alley inhabitants. I also aim to dig a little deeper on the political economy of extractive corporations like that of BP that uphold blue and greenwashing campaigns while redirecting attention to the material estate and processes of neoliberalization. Here are two quotes that support my thesis hypothesis, but I'll read the top one. In an era of high globalization, the sources of environmental harm are often dispersed and entangled in a complex assemblage of corporate power, state authority, local regulations, and capitalist structures of accumulation. To conclude here, I found the data collecting process to be stimulating and look forward to expanding this research over the summer and potentially in grad school. I think this study is important because the two disasters I'm investigating serve as entry points to build out conversations in Black and Latinx geographies and abolition ecology that engage the ways in which white supremacy shapes human relationships with land and the entangled processes of settler colonialism, empire, and racial capitalism. After a content analysis of the situation in Louisiana, and although it is a site of ongoing environmental justice debate, moving forward into this project, I would like to explore the region across the Gulf of Mexico. According to an article posted in The Guardian last year, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill still haunts Mexican communities. BP denies that the oil spill reached Mexico, but fishermen and scientists know it isn't true. 10 years later, and Mexican communities have received zero in compensation. I aim to investigate the impacts of the oil spill on coastal Latinx and indigenous communities and contribute to the ongoing environmental debate surrounding the oil and gas industry. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for everyone who put this together.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for that fabulous presentation. Again, just as a reminder, we'll be taking Q&A at the end of the presentation. However, if you have suggestions or further ideas and would like to engage Jackie, feel free to use the chat box function as well in the meantime, or send your questions to me. So we'll move on now to the next presentation, and it is Arlie Aguilar Luna, who will be presenting effects of imposter syndrome on academic success in Latinx women at UCSC.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen really quickly. Okay, and then also I apologize if my dogs ever bark in the background. Two chihuahuas, so sorry about that in advance. Okay, so I'm presenting my project, which is titled The Effects of Imposter Syndrome on Academic Success on Latinx Women at UCSC. This is part of my senior seminar for LALS. Additionally, I'm an LALS and psychology double major. And so this is the agenda that I'll be going through today. We have the introduction, the literature, the methods, results, and the conclusion. And so to start off, so Latinx first-gen women do face a lot of barriers when it comes to going into higher education, such as financial difficulties. They may sometimes face legal barriers, whether it's their own fights that they have with that, or maybe within the families if they're part of like a mixed status family. They also may face some systemic barriers within higher education. And a lot of times with Latinx first-gen women that I've seen through the literature, as well as in interviews that I've conducted as part of this research, is that their educational goals have become sort of a pathway to their success in overcoming, you know, generational and systemic barriers that may or may not have been placed on their parents and grandparents before them. And so education is a big thing for Latinx first-gen women. I myself, as a Latinx first-gen woman, can completely agree to that personally. And even though they may face a lot of barriers within higher education, we do learn to navigate the systems and eventually build that resilience and strive to reach the academic goals. And even though we are successful a lot of the times, I do believe that the higher education system does need to change in order to accommodate to all these different backgrounds that are coming into higher ed. Latinx students are one of the highest growing population in higher education, so it's important to also have some systemic things in place that would help them reach their goals as well. Additionally, academic success for Latinx first-gen women is often viewed as sort of an extension of their family success. So if these students succeed in school and earn their bachelor's degree, then that kind of shows that their family is succeeding. There's a lot of connection there to familial backgrounds. There's been a cultural mismatch between westernized schooling and social practices, as with the social and familial practices with the majority of families that are of Latinx descent. And imposter syndrome and not belonging within academic spaces is really prevalent within this population, unfortunately. And so my research question is, how do first generation Latinx women at UCSC navigate academic success while experiencing imposter syndrome? And so imposter syndrome is defined as being a condition that describes high achieving individuals who, despite their objective successes, fail to internalize their accomplishments and have persistent self-doubt and fear of being exposed as fraud or imposter. And as part of this research that I did, it's very prevalent in first-gen Latinx women here at UCSC. And then academic success is to the extent to which students have achieved their short or long-term educational goals, which can vary for each student. I didn't have a sort of super defined definition for academic success because I felt it would vary. Some examples might be a certain GPA, like a 2.0 or a 3.0, or even a 4.0. Simply just passing classes, or even just understanding the class material. And so these are the methods that I used as part of this research. My sources of data include Latinx women identifying students at UCSC, and this was during this quarter, this spring 2021 quarter. The ages varied from 17 years old to 25 years old. I had 1 junior, 4 seniors, and 1 grad student, and we used convenience sampling. It was students from labs, from class, or my partner also put something on Instagram to try to get some participants. And we have a total of 6 participants that we interviewed. So it is a qualitative study. And then the data collection included about an hour or less of interviews through Zoom. And it was taped on the iPhone and transcribed using a transcription service called Otter. And we had some questions on experiences at UCSC. For example, like experiences being a first gen, experiences with imposter syndrome, and experiences with their academic performance in terms of how they navigate it with that imposter syndrome. And then the methods of analysis was a thematic analysis. Themes were predicted beforehand based on the literature, some of the literature I provided. And then the reflexivity and limitations, it was a small sample size because it was more of a qualitative study. Obviously, there does need to be more research in this area. And then my personal background may have let these students maybe open up a little bit more, being a first generation transfer Latinx woman myself. And then these are the results that came from the study that I did. So imposter syndrome was prevalent in all the participants that were interviewed. Some of the examples that they provided was not feeling smart enough. They also may have faced some physical symptoms such as a high heart rate, trouble breathing. Some had issues with their blood pressure, as well, feeling like they don't belong in these academic spaces, as well as being hyper aware of their identity as, or feeling like they were different from everybody else. And then I did have a lot of participants that stated that they feel like UCSC doesn't have enough spaces for first-gen Latinx women. And in that sense, one participant explained that there are spaces for first-generation students, but it's not specific for example, BIPOC students like Latinx women. And their needs are a little bit more specific and different from the general population of first-gen students. So they felt like that was an important thing to address here at UCSC. And then for one participant, unfortunately, they did face some discrimination in the STEM field as a first-gen woman. And then for academic performance, there were some participants that felt like imposter syndrome did negatively affect their performance in terms of maybe not feeling like they were smart enough doing the work that they were doing. And so that may have affected their confidence as well as the work itself that they were doing. But imposter syndrome was also used by some participants as kind of like a source of motivation because they felt like they weren't smart enough. They felt like they needed to prove to themselves and to others that they were worthy of being at the institution at UCSC in higher ed. So some of them did say that they used it as a source of motivation. And then the types of coping that a lot of the students used was really community-based. It was from talking to others who may face the same issues with imposter syndrome, such as their friends, maybe their family, seeking support from them. Additionally, more of like the younger generation is starting to seek more outside sources, such as therapy, in order to try to work through things like imposter syndrome. So we did have some participants that were in therapy to try to work through that. And I did realize that there was a lot of introspection as a way of coping, in terms of they would just think about why they felt this way. They would think about why they are actually worthy of being here and all the things that they've done. So they just kind of go back and think about all these things that they've done. And then here's just some meaningful quotes that came out of this research. So Sitlali is a fourth-year transfer student. This is her next year is her last quarter. She said, "There was a situation recently where I was chosen to speak on this panel, and it was awesome. It was really interesting to navigate in that kind of space and grateful to have the chance and the opportunity. But it was really interesting to see and really feel the thing a lot of us feel when walking into those kinds of spaces. And imposter syndrome set in real quick in that, because I kept thinking, am I good enough to be here? It really sucked because I robbed myself of being able to enjoy the fact that someone was like, hey, you seem like a good enough person. Why don't you come on by and speak your piece? I feel like I did it to myself. I really beat myself up for it later on that evening, because I was like, why did I do that? I should have been more out there." And here's another quote. Here's another quote by Line. She's a grad student, a second-year grad student. She said, "As a grad student, the first time I've had imposter syndrome, well, there are many times, but I feel it very often when I'm writing. whether it's for a class, whether it's for a publication, just writing in general sometimes makes me feel like one day someone is going to find out that I got here by chance or that it was a mistake that I got into the institution. Like, this person is not very smart. This person, why is this girl sitting here? I feel it very often in my writing, also sometimes in the way I speak, because one, I know that English is not my first language. So sometimes I have to think about the word, or I stutter, or I use filler words. And so for the conclusion, imposter syndrome was very prevalent in academic spaces, and it did affect academic performance, but it was also used as a form of motivation to prove themselves and others wrong. And academics have catered to more white middle class and upper class male students. So there does need to be some more change there. I know more recently there has been some changes that have been happening in the higher ed institutions, but I think it does need to be a little bit more specific to the different populations that are coming in, especially considering that Latinx is one of the fastest growing populations in higher ed. And then we do need to advocate for more inclusive spaces for Latinx women in order to express themselves. And then also navigating two different cultures is something difficult for first-gen Latinx women. And so it would be important to implement collectivist methods or family core beliefs. And of course, more research needs to be done within this population and topic. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and thanks for organizing all of this.
Thank you, Arlie. That was really, really interesting and so insightful for all of us here at the UCSC community to know what's happening from your perspective. Again, we'll be doing Q&A after the presentations, but feel free to send messages through the chat function to Arlie or to me if you have any questions. Our next presentation will be by Taina Morales, and the title of the presentation is The Beginning of the End, 2020, 500 Years in the Making.
Thank you so much for that introduction and everyone for being here today. I apologize if there are any pop-ups on my screen. I'm working on getting my laptop clean after quite a year. But I am Taina Morales. I am a sociology and LALS double major here at UCSC on my last 2 weeks here. So much I've learned. I wish I could put it all into one big research project, but this is what I got. So this is the beginning of the end, 2020, 500 years in the making. Just a little trigger warning. Some of the topics that I will be discussing today do touch on the violence of settler colonialism, in particular to BIPOC folks, which can always be very triggering. Please feel free to step away or leave, if needed. So to introduce the topics that I will be discussing today, I will be touching on social movements in 2020, in particular to Black Lives Matter, the Mount Rushmore protests, the Capitol Hill insurrection. Another big, if you will, idea that I work with throughout my research is looking at settler colonialism as a structure, not so much an event. Really what brought me to this was my involvement in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests, combined with my interest in Indigenous resistance movements, really prompted me to research the points of intersection in which they challenge colonial legacies in the United States. So to begin, the first movement that I look at, again, is Black Lives Matter, which followed the public murder of George Floyd in 2020, which I believe challenged the white supremacy and Black violence in the United States as colonial racial ideology. Secondly, I look at the 4th of July protests led by the Sioux Nation. In July 2020, dozens of Native and non-Native protesters led by the community members of the Sioux Nation blocked highways in an attempt to prohibit Donald Trump from attending the 4th of July fireworks show in resistance to the national holiday that celebrates the elimination of Native Americans on their ancestral lands. The colonial legacy I believe it challenges is, again, the systemic erasure of ancestral Native lands in the process of nation state making. And then I look at the Capitol Hill insurrection and juxtaposition, which in comparison to movements of the left, I guess I examine this movement by the right as a result of the political discontent with the bipartisan system in the United States. Curiously, while Native communities oppose the United States government for reasons, related to land sovereignty, treaties, the insurgency led by right-wing libertarians also oppose the US government, but does so for less regulation, which is central to neoliberal political ideology. Some of the background that brought me into this research were the courses taken by Deborah Gould, Fernando Leiva, Caitlin Kalia'a, and in particular, I'm looking at the work of Dr. Keegan-Milah Taylor in Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which was really an honor to be able to see her in 2020, right before we went into COVID, and it was just an honor to be there in her presence, because I think that her book really set the foundations on the research that I did. I think that she does a really good job at providing historical analysis of the conditions that contributed to the emergence of Black radicalism in the United States. But it also made a case that Black Lives Matter was also a fight, not so much for racism, but a fight against the capitalist state. I think by examining the social, political, and economic dimensions that prevail the social order, I'm able to see these social movements that were occurring not so much as, if you will, like movements in particular to, Black Lives Matter, Native resistance, but so much as, resisting the settler colonial system. The work that I also look at that very much prompted my research was that of the Red Nation by Nick Estes and Patrick Wolf, as well as Deborah Miranda. So I'm really looking, sorry, let me grab my notes. I'm really looking at settler colonialism again as a structure, not an event, which employed the organization grammar of race. Both Indians and Black people in the United States have been racialized in imposing ways that reflect their I'm nervous. I'm so sorry, y'all. Okay, we're just gonna skip that. Roles in the formation of U.S. society. I'm also looking at decolonization as prompted by Nick Estes in the Red Nation. Decolonization is a future-oriented project that requires imagining, building, and fighting for forms of nationhood and self-determination, not premise on the relations of exploitation, dispossession, elimination, and extraction that define liberal nationalisms, and capitalist imperial and colonial formations. So this really brings me to my research question, if you will, which is how have social movements in 2020 unveiled the instability of settler colonialism and its legacies in the US? What are the legacies being challenged by Black Lives Matter, as well as Native resistance movements? And more importantly, what can we learn from the intersections of these movements? While there is a substantial amount of literature of BIPOC resistance movements throughout US history, the social movements that occurred in 2020 are so recent and arguably time sensitive. 2020 was such a historic year for so many reasons. There's a very loud truck outside my window, so I apologize for that noise. 2020 was such a historic year for many reasons. It has often been referred to as the 1969 of social movements, but I believe that both 1969 as well as 2020 were challenging a system that was never made to serve BIPOC communities by design. This proposal aims to provide a foundation for further conversations and research to be conducted on modern day colonial resistance movements in the United States, which I very much believe that these movements were anti-colonial and worked in the periphery of decolonization. So as mentioned, I do believe that, these issues were time sensitive in a sense that I was actually living through them, right? And so I was seeing these events on TV, I was watching them on the news, I was definitely, observing a lot from social media, because I believe social media, allowed us to post what was happening in live action. And I believe that that's when data, right, is most fruitful. So I did a content analysis using different data coding systems, but mostly through searching through different hashtags such as Black Lives Matter, Land Back, Decolonize, MAGA, Blue Lives Matter. Again, remembering that I was also looking at movements of the right. And in doing so, I was able to not just realize how real censorship is on social media, because again, right, we have to remember that Within the past 2 decades, social media has really been utilized as a dominant platform for social movements to organize, distribute information, and gain support. Although this does come with many challenges, as I mentioned, like censorship. So, nevertheless, social media has become a live source of information for billions of users all over the world. Within seconds, we're able to see what's happening, creating these global communication networks between social movements, enhancing both solidarity and awareness. In the future, I would love to take this proposal into grad school, conducting surveys, interviews with organizers, with activists, with students, and people just involved in discourse and conversation with such movements. So this brings me to my hypotheses, which in the process of doing my research, so many other social movements have occurred in which I'm making so many connections and intersections, and I wish I had time right this year to put everything together, but so much was happening. And really what I believe is as long as the powers of coloniality persist and evolve, so will the people's resistance to the capitalist and the settler state. What's happening in Colombia, what's happening in Palestine is not a fight against austerity. And just last week alone, we saw the burning of the United States as well as the Israeli flags, which, to me, in the way I see it, this is a full-fledged fight against imperialism and capitalism. How I see settler colonialism within the frameworks of Patrick Fezzi, describes it. It's that settler colonialism is a 15th century software running on 21st century hardware. And this is why we are seeing so much resistance. This is why we're seeing so many different movements occurring all over the world, because this imperial shit can no longer continue. So I just had to put that out there. In conclusion, the results of my content analysis provided me with such rich data and support for my theoretical hypotheses. I'm looking forward to expanding this research into grad school, where I hope to engage in conversations about solutions rather than problems, which I hope I've made very obvious to everyone by now. One of the biggest challenges I anticipate to run in is, again, the censorship of content, just because, again, social media and, social media CEOs and their shareholders, really are upholding capitalism as well as imperialism. And while my research is rooted in theoretical analysis, this has very real consequences, not only people, but the planet. Settler colonialism, as argued by Nick Estes, is an inherently extractivist project on the planet with finite natural resources. The fight for decolonization is also a fight for the future of our planet. So as mentioned by the Red Nation at this point, it is decolonization or extinction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Taina, and just a really phenomenal archive of 2020 that you've compiled. The images were so compelling and powerful, really, really great. And thank you so much for sharing. So we're gonna go on to our next presentation now, and Nadia Perez will be presenting Reclaiming Their Own Spaces, the Revolutionary Latina Sorority Experience at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
Hello, everybody. This is the project that I have been working on all quarter. And well, my name is Nadia and I'm a junior this year, but I will be graduating next year. And so my research question asks, how do Latina sororities at UC Santa Cruz engage first generation students to a full collegiate citizenship through academic support and extracurricular activities? So the agenda for today is that I will be discussing these topics, why it matters, the objectives, the literature review, methodology and sample findings, and the significance of my project. So why does my research matter, and why should we care about Latina sororities at UC Santa Cruz? Here at UC Santa Cruz, we don't like Greek organizations very much because of the stereotypes that come with it. However, what we are ignoring are that these are usually coming from predominantly white Greek life, and most people in the institution are not even aware that cultural sororities exist. Whether we love them or hate them, these organizations are part of the college experience for many Latina students on campus. So my objective for this project is to destigmatize Latina sororities in the Santa Cruz climate and dignify them as a political establishment that they have institutionalized for themselves. I want to share the aspects of this experience that can teach college community members something about retention through a home away from home. So for this project, I reviewed and analyzed about 10 different journal articles, and this is what my literature review revealed. And the first thing was its history. So higher institutions were created to maintain power dynamics and keep the marginalized in the margins. Universities do not cater to Latina women because they were not made for them. The next thing was the next thing that the literature review revealed was that the college transition is difficult for everyone. However, because of intersectionality, Latina women can find themselves struggling more than the average student. And next, all research found Latina sororities to be a positive space for students. Those who joined sororities benefited from academic capital, skills, knowledge, and emotional support that ultimately resulted in a personal educational persistence. And the last thing the researchers all agreed was that Latinx Greek life provides individuals with people who look like them while recognizing and valuing them at the same time. This is important because it opens up a space for students to become a citizen of a community on campus. And oh yeah, there's two more main points that the literature review revealed. And the next thing was mainly focused on philanthropy. Most Latina sororities' prime values surround philanthropy. One of the readings discussed a sorority that collected clothing for children in detention centers in the midst of the pandemic. And the last main point made by previous research called for the necessity of Latina sororities in predominantly white institutions as their prime goal, because their prime goal is to build a home away from home. In my sampling method was voluntary sampling because I reached out to 3 of the organizations, but only those who volunteered were taken into consideration. I interviewed a total of 5 members, and I required participants to be first generation college students and to have at least a full year membership in the sorority so that they could better share their experiences in the sorority and the ways that they have benefited from the Greek organization. The interviews lasted about 30 minutes via Zoom, and I surveyed them on academic achievement, sense of belonging, and other opportunities regarding their Greek or affiliations. And my findings revealed that all participants noticed academic support in one way or another. Some benefited from the more explicit events like study rooms and group checks, but other participants benefited from seeing familiar faces in their courses and benefited from teacher recommendations from their peers in the organization. The next finding was that all participants revealed to have been highly encouraged to take leadership positions. They were given the opportunity to run different chairs, varying from positions such as philanthropy, academic, and eventually promoted to president positions. These positions gave participants the chance to take charge of their college experience and lead other Latina women in the institution. And all participants' networks expanded to outside organizations through community service, fundraisers, and other events. In addition to the expansion on campus, Participants revealed to have created connections with the outside community and alumni through event collaborations. Participants emphasized that their organizations became a home away from home. Several of them found older sisters to whom they could look up to and find inspiration in their educational careers. Members explained that their organizations helped them open up and finally feel like a part of the university, even if the university itself was not always inclusive. And all participants revealed that their prospective sororities helped them cope with mental health problems in the midst of the pandemic. Participants who revealed that meeting with participants revealed that meeting with sisters via Zoom calls provided them with a safe space to talk about their feelings. And the last thing is I'm going to be talking about is the significance of my research. And because Latina sororities are structurally constructed and run by Latina women themselves, we should be paying more attention to these spaces. Schools can imitate their structures to make their institutions more welcoming to marginalized communities. Schools should begin recognizing their potential and begin prioritizing these spaces instead of demonizing these spaces. Perhaps college officials should be learning from them. After all, they are organized by Latina women themselves. It is time to recognize that through all the obstacles imposed on Latina women, they have thrived through their own creations. And my research aims to destigmatize Latina sororities in the Santa Cruz climate, to dignify them as the political establishments that they have institutionalized for themselves. And this is just my references. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for your presentation. Again, just another reminder that if you have any questions, we will be doing question and answer at the end of the presentations, as well as feel free to use the chat box to send questions the way of our fabulous researchers if you're unable to stay that long, or to me. We're moving on now to our next presentation. It's going to be a group presentation on human rights investigations into targeting Indigenous defenders and disinformation on COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. The researchers who will be presenting are Jocelyn Cerros, Lorena Hernandez, and Teresa Rodriguez.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Cerros. I'm an undergraduate student research with the Human Rights Lab, and I want to start off by talking about the lab. The Human Rights Investigations Lab is housed in the Research Center for the Americas, a nearly 30-year interdisciplinary research center at UC Santa Cruz, based in the Division of Social Sciences. The Human Rights Investigations Lab opened in September of 2019 with the mission of advancing social justice research in response to ongoing human rights violations in the Americas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lorena Hernandez Rivera. I am a third-year Latin American and Latinx Studies Sociology combined major. I conducted my research with the Human Rights Investigations Lab, and I will be speaking on online open source information. So this is the information that is publicly available on the internet, and there are many common types of online open source information, and we have some examples here. And I would just like to highlight, it goes from anywhere from social media content, geospatial imagery and mapping data, and public administrative records and leaked confidential documents.
Hello everyone, my name is Teresa Rodriguez Sotelo. I'm a double major in LALS and Spanish Studies and a undergraduate research at the lab. So what are some common open source information techniques? We use Discovery first to conduct targeted online researches to find statements, videos, images, or anything. Then with that information, we conduct geolocation, that is to approximate or have the exact coordinates from where the picture or video was recorded. And then we can do chronolocation also, that is to approximate or have the exact time when the picture or video was taken. And then with all the information, then we do digital mapping that is producing data visualization that can expose connection between human rights, location, and the relevance of these data points. In the report, Disinformation, the COVID-19 Pandemic in Latin America, we conducted a 3-month open source investigation during fall 2020 on the spread of disinformation about COVID-19 in Latin America. The primary focus of this research were Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela, since they are the most populous countries in Latin America. As a team of 4 undergraduate students, 3 graduate students, a research advisor, and a research director, we sought to understand the extent of online disinformation as the world confronted a pandemic we have not experienced in over 100 years. It is important first to understand misinformation and disinformation. Both of them are false information. But when it is intentional, then we call it disinformation, and when it's without intent to enacting harm, then it's misinformation. One of our initial questions was if public officials are the spreaders of disinformation, then how can communities effectively counteract that disinformation and make informed decisions that do not further harm their lives? Our primary focus was the messaging online from public officials. One part of the report is based on 4 milestones. The data was collected from NA COVID milestone, rely on Crown Tangle from January 1st to October 25, 2020, and information was collected in an interactive timeline. The first milestone was the first mention of COVID-19. Second and third, the first official COVID case and death. And number 4, the first official state nationwide announcement of COVID-19 strategies. Then we create a 2 tracking COVID-19 narratives by officials. This was in order to monitor the 2 COVID-19 narratives. We primarily used TweetDeck. We conducted several focused online researches with attention to days, hashtags, location, keywords on this platform. The narrative 1, the online messaging about COVID-19 medication from public government officials, including health ministers in Latin America. Based on our research, Brazil and Venezuela spread disinformation about medicines to COVID-19, while other countries, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, tried to counter this invalid information. For narrative number 2, we traced messaging about emergency of a vaccine, and the purpose in monitoring the online messaging regarding the vaccine was to determine the level of support or not and the frequency messaging about the combating this global crisis. Anti-vaccine messages did not emerge based on our research from elected officials. Many understood and made it public know that a vaccine will be what leads to a change in the course, and I think we are seeing it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for your report on COVID disinformation in Latin America. And good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting on my lab team's social media report on Black Lives Matter. This report was prepared by Dr. Silvana Falcon and researched remotely by the undergraduate student team in the fall of 2020 over the course of approximately 8 to 10 weeks. My team and I researched on 3 major areas of focus. The first one being the types of disinformation online as presented in a table. I will personally be speaking on the Twitter rules and anti-Black Lives Matter accounts that my partner and I highlighted, in which we investigated several prominent Twitter users with a following of 100,000 people and counting. And the final section of the report was Black Lives Matter disinformation in the US 2020 election, happening real time, the investigations during the presidential race that we just went through. And 2 tools that I want to highlight for everyone where we predominantly use Twitter and a software called TweetDeck. So this is a little about the team. My partner, Sydney Elliott, and I led the investigations behind the Twitter rules and anti-Black Lives Matter accounts. Our undergraduate team manager, Erica Manalastas, led the investigations behind the Black Lives Matter disinformation in the US election. And our partners, Jessica de la Cruz and Jamie Maldomag, led the investigations behind finding the types of disinformation in the media. I will be highlighting 3 major research themes that my partner Sydney and I investigated in our findings. The first one was that there were these narratives going around on Twitter and the major hashtags around the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests that Black Lives Matter is not what they seem to be, and narratives of false equivalency. We investigated prominent Twitter users with a pattern of posting misinformation and disinformation about Black Lives Matter. And Twitter acknowledges disinformation and misinformation as harmful to the public and as unable to be ignored. But if Twitter wants to educate and take care of the public, shouldn't these Black Lives Matter misinformation and disinformation content fall under the same scrutiny? This was one of the major research questions that my partner and I wanted to really dig at. The next slide, please. And I wanted to share some key takeaways with everyone here today. In our conclusion, we found that the posts that we investigated in this report were discriminatory, harmful, and they violated Twitter's rules about safety and hateful conduct policy. Twitter accounts that attack the Black Lives Matter movement misled hundreds of thousands of people. Majorly in the US scale, we mainly investigated Twitter content from the US, but we wanted to acknowledge their reach and how they're still up to date and still affecting these spaces online. And our final point is that it's so significant because they threaten the safety and security of Black people and their allies. As these power dynamics continue today, we're still seeing so many incidents of violence on Black bodies in society. So we just wanted to highlight this in our report. And yes, thank you, everyone. I will now be passing it along to Yoselin for her presentation.
Thank you, Lorena. Before I showcase my team's research from the past 8 months, I would like to introduce myself and my research group. Once again, my name is Yoselin. I'm majoring in LALS and politics, and I'm the undergraduate team manager of this research group. Starting on the left, we have Alejandra, who is a PhD student in LALS, and next to her we have Angie Valencia, who's majoring in politics, and Daniela Jacobs, who's majoring in sociology. Throughout this academic school year, we've worked alongside Cultural Survival, an Indigenous-led NGO, to remember some of the lives lost in the last year and celebrate their legacy. Through our lab's ongoing partnership with Cultural Survival, we've learned how to translate and switch between collaborative and individual research skills. Through open source investigations, my team and I were able to help Cultural Survival seek accountability and justice for the Indigenous human rights defenders murdered in 2020. According to Frontline Defenders, at least 331 human rights defenders were killed in 2020. While Indigenous peoples make up only 6% of the global population, they represent nearly 1/3 of the human rights defenders killed. More than 3/4 of the total murders of human rights defenders were in Latin America, making it the most dangerous region in the world to protect environmental, land, and human rights. With the help of online open source information, my team and I were able to help Cultural Survival report on the lives of 28 Indigenous human rights defenders. As much as I would love to commemorate the lives of all 28 defenders today, I will be presenting on only one Indigenous human rights defender. Through our discoveries, we found that Jose Abelardo Luis Huetia was a NASA Indigenous radio journalist in Corinto, Colombia. Jose died 6 days after his 34th birthday on August 7th, 2020. Allegedly at the hands of the National Army. He was killed while recording an altercation between Indigenous life defenders and troops from the Colombian Army and National Police. Footage of the events of August 13th show Jose continuing to film until he is shot to the ground. Medical personnel and vehicles going to retrieve Jose were blocked by the armed forces. The murder of Jose is part of a larger liberation effort of Nasa tribes across Colombia to reclaim ancestral lands. The Nasa people seek to reclaim sovereignty over their land and reestablish more sustainable farming practices. Jose is only one of the many indigenous human rights and land defenders that have been killed for their activism. The ongoing violence in Colombia has resulted in approximately 1,000 reported assassinations of social leaders since the signing of the peace agreement in 2016. We'd like to end off by thanking Professor Falcon for giving us this opportunity to do this type of research and really make an impact, and by thanking our lab partners and supporters. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for that fabulous presentation on the really diverse sets of questions and research that's happening in the Human Rights Lab, really central issues facing the Americas today. So thank you to the entire group for showing us how those questions are being approached and answered at the lab. We're going to move on now to our next presentation. Teresa Rodriguez will be presenting on the research titled Pathway to Citizenship, discussion on who deserves to be recognized in the United States, who will benefit with the proposed new bill, and who is left out.
Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Rodriguez Sotelo. I'm a double major in Latin American and Latinx Studies and Spanish Studies, and I will be presenting my research on new proposed bill, present a pathway to citizenship, who deserves to be recognized and who is left out. My initial research question is who deserves to be recognized in the United States, who will benefit with the proposed new bill, and who is left out. This question is starting to come to my mind when the new bill was proposed and was all over the news. So I decided that I wanted to know more about it and to be informed so I could really understand it and explain it to my community. So my main idea is that the creation of hierarchy of immigrants is now more evident and notorious because of policies that the government has made. New narratives demand that undocumented people not only be recognized for their work, but as individuals that have socially rooted in the United States. I argue that some immigrants have been categorized as less deserving groups and that the new bill is excluding the less privileged groups of immigrants and emphasizing that immigrants that deserve citizenship are farm workers, DACA, and TPS recipients. For my theoretical framework, I draw from Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, the Undocumented Americans. In particular, I find her discussion of diversity and expected deservingness of immigrants illuminating. Not all immigrants are dreamers, yet the Biden administration proposed changes to immigration law and policy privilege a narrow subset of immigrants, dreamers, TPS holders, and farm workers. Immigrants are more than those three groups. Immigrants are normal and regular people too. They are just as complicated and diverse as any other group of people. The population of immigrants is really diverse and not all immigrants are deserving dreamers. So many immigrants are left out in the conversation about politics and social life. One of my primary sources that I use is the fact sheet from President Biden proposed new bill from the White House website. In the bill, it is stated that DACA, TPS holders, and farm workers will have the chance to become permanent residents immediately, while all other undocumented immigrants need to follow at least a 5-year path to become a resident. In this document, the language and the narrative support my arguments and phrases as earn roadmap to citizenship make us think that there is just certain things that immigrants need to do in order to earn or deserve to be recognized. Later in the same part, we find how dreamers, CPS holders, and immigrant farm workers are those who earn the citizenship and need to be recognized immediately. In the next section, they even narrow the group of people who qualify for the immediately permanent resident as the student from U.S. universities with STEM degrees. This led me to think, why are these three groups so important for the government? Well, DACA recipients are skilled labor that help to all communities to grow, mainly economically. For that reason, the government is so interested in them. Also because in some way the dreamers have become the American dream and are the inspiration of other undocumented immigrants. Then we have the TPS holders, and in here I highlight the part temporary, because most of the people who has this permit is going to be here just temporary, and most likely they will go back to their country when the program ends. Or many of them who qualify are already social rooted, and they have families, and for that reason they will not back to their countries. Then we have the farm workers that are extremely important to keep for the government because they are the ones who produce the food for a cheap payment. If there is no farm workers, then who is going to do their work for such a low wages and in extreme circumstances, as we know with the pandemic and even when there were fires all over California? At the bottom of the hierarchy, all of other immigrants, undocumented immigrants that do not fit in those three categories. They are second responders, they are in our everyday life. Most of the time they have been here for more than 20 years doing essential work at the markets, restaurant, or as housekeepers. I would like to end with the story of Paloma from the book Undocumented American. She is a second responder that she was helping in Ground Zero after the 9/11. She helped to clean up everything. Now she's severely sick with cancer, gastritis, asthma, and other complications that are results of her work at Ground Zero. She's receiving the small grants that the government gives to people that was affected in the 9/11, but she does not fit on the groups of the people who can qualify for citizenship immediately, even though that will help her to receive better treatments for her sickness. Just as Paloma, we know many other cases of people that can be our neighbors, peers, or co-workers that have done everything for the better of this country and that they call now their home. Finally, my research do not have the intention to argue that those three groups, the DACA, the TPS, and the farm workers, do not deserve the citizenship, but rather I want to highlight how other groups are categorized like less deserving, creating this hierarchy of immigrants' deservingness. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, for your presentation. We are now moving on to our final presentation of the day, and then we'll go on to Q&A for those of you who are able to stay and join us. And our final presentation is by Montserrat Lopez on the project Soto Norte, Extractivism and Socio-Environmental Conflicts. And it's a project with Popo Klotz and Rosa Cimental.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that I did work in the project Soto Norte with Rosa and Opa, where we researched our case study about Soto Norte. And also my professor is also here, so shout out to Professor Leiva. So today I will be discussing how the mining company has developed today in Colombia and how this mining project will continue to develop over the next 20 years and how it can affect the community moving forward. What is going on in Bucaramanga, Colombia? Is Minesa exploiting resources? What is Soto Norte? Sociedad Minera de Santander, also known as Minesa, has been working on a 1.2 billion project called the Soto Norte Project since 2015. In the proposal, they have included that they will develop an underground mine near the towns of California and Suratá, right outside the boundaries of the Páramo de Santurban. Here's the Soto Norte project timeline. In 2015, they created the proposal and then took it to the environmental licensing phase to get the permits. In 2020, they started constructing the underground mine. However, due to the pandemic, the construction of the mine has slowed down. In 2024, Minesa plans to begin extracting gold until 2045. Where they have predicted to generate more than 9 million ounces of gold, to which none will go to the community. And then this is a picture of the mine currently. I can't find this picture anymore, so I saved it on here, so that was a good thing. Why is the Páramo de Santurban so important? The Páramo has a very unique ecosystem. The soil of the Páramo can absorb rain throughout the dry season. Because of this, the Páramo is a source of fresh water for the community. Nearly 2 people rely on this fresh water supply. Defending the Páramo has been an ongoing environmental conflict to protect people's livelihoods from mining corporations. And then this was the fun part that I did. So using geolocation, I was able to locate the mine, the mining company Minesa, where they plan to extract gold from, and how close the Páramo de Santurban is located at. In yellow, we can see that that's Minesa, and then they have built already like their corporation in there. And then the orange is the Páramo de Santurban. And then in green, we see where Bucaramanga is located at, which is a city where many community members have come to protest against the mining corporation. And also, if it were to happen, like the mining affects the environmental system of the Páramo, it can affect that whole community. So Minesa has been going under an investigation because of allegations of affecting the Páramo's ecosystem. The Páramo is an area where mining has been banned for many years. The owners of Minesa were allegedly non-compliant with the environmental regulations. Because of this, there has been a pushback from the community. In May of 2019, 50,000 people gathered in the plaza asking Minesa to leave Santander. And then that's an image that we captured in the news. For this project, we also created a timeline called Timeline JS. This is also the fun part to do. So we added all our important resources to our study case to give a complete picture of the timeline and a visual presentation. So this is the first thing that we wrote down here. And basically this is the start of the project. They created like videos on YouTube explaining how the mine will work and all that. Sorry, and then it's gonna play by itself. Okay, sorry. I'm going to be showing a few important sources that we found throughout our investigation. So this YouTube video was published in 2016, states how community members are working to create tourism as an alternative way instead of the mining industry and against the gold project. So the community has been working against to get Minesa out of like the town that they are in. In 2017 is where we see the investigation against Minesa, which may cause environmental conflicts to the Páramo's ecosystem. And then as you can see, this is in Spanish, and a lot of articles that we read were in Spanish and English. And we never really like translated them because I felt like the effect was better to give it in Spanish and English. Then we see more pushback from the miners. Around 100 people were holding signs and blocking the entrance. These were all miners from California, and they were all blocking an entrance where you can go through Minesa. On Twitter, there was a leaked video where the head of the mining corporation states that the community is not important on their agenda, which is why we see such a pushback from the community. And then as of May 2019, there was thousands of people rallying against the Minesa's gold project. Lastly, as of October 2020, we discovered that ANLA, the National Authority of Environmental License, issued an evaluation for their environmental licensing due to all the complications that Minesa has caused for the community and the permissions and all the grants and all that. So since this was during my fall, when I took this class in the fall, I wasn't able to continue this case study, but hopefully in the summer, I will come back to this project because it was really interesting to learn. And then this is all our group reflections that we created. So yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Montserrat, for that presentation. I now want to invite everyone who's still here to do a round of applause for all of our researchers. You can use the little image or even take your audio off and make the sound. So we have a little bit of the effect. Woo, yes, absolutely, absolutely phenomenal. Let's keep the round of applause going for Montserrat for doing a lot of the work of putting this fabulous event together. We're so indebted to you, and it was so exciting to hear your research and the entire group's research. So thank you so much. And keep the applause going for Ursula, our phenomenal undergraduate advisor, for leading students through really, research is challenging, and research under the conditions of COVID even more challenging. So thank you. Keep the round of applause going. We are at the time that we're scheduled more or less to end, and I do want to let everyone know that we will be continuing afterwards with some Q&A if you would like to stay and ask some questions to our scholars, or any questions or suggestions that you have about their research. However, before we go to that, I also noticed that many of the researchers acknowledged and gave shout outs to faculty. And so before we go and conclude, I wanted to give some space if any faculty who may not be able to stay for the Q&A session have a moment to say some words. I can speak on behalf of LALS and just say how proud and impressed we are, but it would be great. It's not just me. I think I don't want to speak for everyone. So I do want to open that up for those of you who are here. Yeah, Fernando, please.
Very quick, I want to congratulate all of you. This was phenomenal, phenomenal. The quality of the research and the presentations made me connect. This is what we as faculty do, what we do. We want to see this type of work, grow, and really proud of your work. You should feel incredibly proud of your work. I'm really proud of you and happy to have seen the quality of your efforts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Leyva. Professor Taft.
I wish I could stay and ask questions and chat with all of you, but I have to go. But I also just wanted to say how great it is to see some of the things that I saw developing in 100A come to fruition in all of these projects as well. I know folks enter that class sometimes being like, I don't do research. What are research methods? But it was so clear from all of this, like that there are all of these different pieces that you've been pulling from all of the different courses that you've been taking. And so it's just a real pleasure to see this incredible set of studies making these amazing contributions and clearly drawing from what you've learned here in LALS and then taking your own spin with it and focusing on the things that matter to you and building your own work as scholars, which is the whole point of that class. So it's really, really nice to see that being enacted here, right? That you all are researchers without a doubt. So congrats, really great to see.
Excellent. So again, round of applause and thank you so much to everyone who participated and organized. So we'll take a moment to do some Q&A, and I'll start with a couple of observations and notes that I have and would like to share with everyone. And then feel free to I have everyone's screen, so if you actually raise your hand, I'll see you, or if you'd like to do the raise hand function, we can do that as well. But just a couple of observations being, one, something that was just so phenomenal in the presentations was how well you are all at storytelling and bringing together really disparate events over the past year, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's the stories of extractivism and resistance to mega projects. Piecing these things together and crafting a narrative is so fundamental and is research. Like, that's a lot of hard work to create and craft a narrative that makes sense about something as it's going on. And that's really a skill that I hope that you all saw, and I hope that you all see as, wow, I have that skill, and you can go forward and do that in the world as you leave USC and continue on. I also noticed that many of you concluded with having more questions, and that's exactly where you want to be. I think that if doing research it's challenging, and we want to like have an end and put an end and period and enter tab, but we often find that it's more and more questions that we have, and that's exactly the space that we want to be in. And just another note on commending you all for staying within the time limit. It's very difficult to have complex, challenging issues, a story to tell, and synthesize that down into a short amount of time. And you all did just a really fabulous job doing that. And I want you to see that too, as that's part of doing research, is figuring out how to have so many things going on in a story and bring it into 10 minutes and share it and make it and tell us how important it is. So many key things, and just something that Professor Taft had said about, like, this is research. Like, these are all, I could list even more ways that all that you were doing was truly research and true contributions to scholarship and the LALS intellectual community. So those were my notes and observations as a whole about the presentations. And so now do please put any questions if you have any specific questions or general questions. We'd love to hear them, or questions for each other. Ursula, our first question.
Okay, so I'm going to try to make this understandable. But first of all, amazing presentations. I love them all. I didn't put it in the chat, but every time, just mind blown. And I did notice kind of a theme, understandably, in a lot of the presentations of, this systemic issues that you're studying, and injustice. And so I was wondering, when you think about, or if we think about rebuilding or reimagining these spaces, I'm curious if any of you kind of want to be part of that process as well. Like, you're on the research end and the identifying and the thinking about it. Like, do any of you see yourself as change makers, rethinking economic systems or educational systems, or all of the different many ways that we could improve what is happening here in the US?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think that throughout the courses I've taken here at UCSC, in particular to the LALS department, something that I've really come to understand is the importance of storytelling, right? And telling the truths about history, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. I think that all of us have definitely benefited from colonialism in one way or another. But I think that we've reached a point in history where we can no longer shy away from those truths. And I think that what we can do as academics, right, like all of us here, I believe, will be doing amazing things, producing amazing work. And in doing so, we have to remember, the truth, to be honest in the stories that we tell, not just about our communities, but other communities. And I think that 2020 was just such a critical time, right, to where all these systemic issues came into just like 1 year, right, where we were forced to really see them for what they were. I think that the settler colonial system in itself was really unveiled, right, for all of its dark truths. So I think that the ways that we can all be involved is just, continuing to tell the narratives that we know to be true, continuing to, fight for what we know is right. And the work that we're producing right now, the discourse that we're having, shapes the real world. So, really being critical of the conversations that we're having in the spaces that we enter.
Just want to add to that. Yeah, I mean, I never really thought I would even be interested in doing this type of work, right? And now I feel like, I'm in it and I'm ready to, take things by the storm, to be honest, because I think that, being in academia, I find that it's important that we just kind of like make the bridges between the non-academic world. And it's like we're learning all these things, but to my family, for example, they have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. So I think that just kind of like making these connections with like real issues, real systemic problems that are happening. And I think that it's just a matter of really talking about them and trying to find ways to make things better, if that's a policy change or, you know what I mean? So yeah, I definitely think, although I never saw myself doing this type of work, I think that it's couldn't be more critical at this time, considering, where we are now, as a society, as a world, as a planet. So yeah.
I think, Jackie, that point that you're making about, or this tension between how does my family understand what I'm doing, or how do I bring these questions and these approaches that I'm doing here, whether it's for class or for, something for school, into outside of that world. And I actually found that to be one of the themes in Arlie's presentation. And that was like one of the tension that it seemed like, Arlie, a lot of your interlocutors found themselves dealing with. Like, for instance, one of something that I was really curious about in your project had to do with if you found that there were differences between how Latinx women themselves understood academic success, and how that was different or coincided with how their families understood academic success, because you talked about that relationship, but that seems to be the same part of that tension that Jackie was pointing to. So I was wondering if you had any thing to add from there, from your research.
Definitely. So one of my findings was kind of like talking about academic success in the perspective of the families or the parents versus like the perspective of the students a little bit. So what I found was that families kind of see success as more of like I guess you could say like the cookie cutter, getting good grades and all that stuff. And a lot of the participants were stating that they were kind of tired of seeing academic success in the normal like way that education is viewed, where it's good grades, straight A's, all that. And they kind of started gearing more into seeing it as actually understanding the material and being able to apply it to real world, like in life. Another thing too that I noticed was like with Latinx women, there's a lot of gender roles with that, with like the academic success stuff too, because it's not just being successful there, but it's also being successful within the family. So you kind of have to do both with that, if that answers your question.
Any other questions? All right, so we have a question from Sophie in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. And feel free, anyone, just to unmute yourself if you have a perspective or would like to contribute to the response. And the question is, what were some of the biggest obstacles you encountered during your research?
I can go for this one. For me, it was just time. I only did this thing for 3 months, my presentation. And then also, meanwhile, I was working with the LALS department and working And then also with the human rights investigation, having my internship with them. And then just 3 other classes I had to take. And it was just so much. So yeah, I think just time was like the biggest obstacle for me and having so many things at once. But hopefully, how I said before, like I plan in the summer to even go back doing this because it's still going on and it might affect, even if this does goes on, like this project might be like until 2045 or 2045 or even longer than that if things happen, right? So I think it's like a whole thing of time, but also let's see what happens with this project.
Any other obstacles or unexpected things that changed? Lorena, I see you have your hand raised. Why don't you go?
Yeah, I just wanted to share about my team's research. We worked with, Professor Falcon and my teammates at the Research Center for the Americas and the Human Rights Investigations Lab. And I was able to speak on my presentation because this is a public report that we produce. We are under a non-disclosure agreement where there's a lot of projects that a lot of my other teammates can't like speak on for like the safety of our partners. So I feel that in a way, I'm like, okay, that's really good that I was able to like share about it. And I wanted to speak on like the different conditions that we worked under. It is still like the internship, but we have a lot of different rules about like being careful about the kind of content that we're taking in because this is all real life happening during the 2020 protests of Black Lives Matter. So being careful with the kind of content that we took in. And there were funneling it through like our research question. It was very, pretty broad. It was just about how is disinformation and misinformation about Black Lives Matter being played out in the media. And then from there, we got to choose the different social media apps and different softwares and programs that we've learned in the trainings for the Human Rights Lab. And knowing how to time manage and work as a team. And this is my first time ever doing research, and I'm so happy to be able to do it. And it's just like, I thought it was a pretty exciting like topic that I was assigned with my group. So one of the obstacles were definitely like being careful with the content that we were taking in, making sure it isn't affecting like our personal lives because it can be pretty graphic and violent, as well as understanding our positionalities and our privilege of being so detached from the current crises that were going on that we were investigating, like acknowledging that piece, as well as there was so much that we wanted to talk about like in my presentation. It had to be like shared, so I had to be careful, or not careful, but like really selective about the data that I was telling everyone. But there was like so much more that we wrote about in the report and our actual investigation and our notes. So just like pinpointing exactly what we can share, like what space there is to share. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with everyone here.
Yeah, these are all sort of, especially when it's your first time doing research, the sort of unexpected encounters, time, that the topics can be very heavy, and making sure that you take care of yourself too is very important. Any other final obstacles or things maybe that you would want to share to if someone was considering thinking about doing research, and what advice you might have for them? Go for it, Jackie.
I would just say, it obviously depends on your research, but for me, what I was struggling with was the amount of news that was related to, for example, the two events. And so there was a lot on Hurricane Katrina. There was a lot on the oil spill, and I was definitely trying to like absorb like all the information possible. I was watching like documentaries because I was really interested. I'm just wanting to know what happened. But for me, like when you're dealing with too much data, I feel like just kind of figuring out the best way to like structure your ideas, so I was able to put everything in a Word doc, organize it by genre, by like event, and just like by like titles and stuff like that. It's just really the process. Like I just have so much, and it's just pages and pages on just notes, quotes that I've taken, or just like links to articles. And so that's kind of was my process. That was really an obstacle, just kind of navigating through all this information and then finding more more interesting like scholarship, for example, that I could add in. So that was kind of a struggle, finding more stuff. But yeah, that was one of the struggles.
Well, you did a great job filtering down the proliferation of information that must have been out there. Any other final pieces of advice or lessons or things to think about in the future? Oh,
Can I
okay,
just
Ursula.
really quickly say a big thank you to Professor Perez for guiding us through this this afternoon. I really appreciate your experienced presence here running this the research symposium. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. One of the best ways to spend an afternoon is to hear all that you all have been doing. Really, really awesome. My pleasure. All right. Well, with that, we will conclude the LALS Research Symposium. And again, thank you to the organizers, Montserrat and Ursula, and everyone who stayed around, asked questions, and presenters.